Good morning, nerds. Today we will be talking about what makes something, or really what makes someone average, in a tabletop RPG. See, I've been working on a massive review of Cyberpunk Red, and as I've been kind of clearing a bit of writer's block on that front, I've had a kind of thought come into my mind. What makes something or someone average? Cyberpunk Red has a very weak, almost non-existent sense of what an average character is. But in some RPGs it's quite strong, and in some it's quite strange and quite complex. So I wanted to dive into this idea and see what it's all about. So to do this, I will start out by defining what an average is, or really what averages are. There is more than one type of average in a tabletop RPG, and I'll go through each of them in turn and how they interrelate. I'll then look at what averages are used for, what they're meant to do, and I'll apply this based on genre and see how different styles of RPGs use averages in different ways. And finally, I'll close out with a bit of a case study on Cyberpunk Red and what it looks like when an RPG has weak averages or no averages. And with all that done, I will tie this video in a clever little bow. So, if we want to talk about why averages are important in a tabletop RPG, we first need to talk about what they even are. The way I see it, there are three types of average, and the first two very much feed into the third. Now, the first of those types is the average ability. This is the numerical baseline that is called out in the rules as being what an average person would have. Now this could be a single value, like the die rating in Savage Worlds or the exponent number in Burning Wheel, or it could be a combination of two values, usually stat and skill, as in Cyberpunk 2020 or in Alien. Now, if you have anything higher than that, you're considered an absolute Chad, and if you have anything lower than that, then sorry, but you suck. And yep, that is how that works. Now, the second one is a bit more complicated, and that is the average difficulty. And what that is the baseline that the GM uses for setting the difficulty of a task that you roll for. Now, there are two ways of doing this that RPGs tend to use. The first way is you set a target number which has been met or beaten. So for instance, in Cyberpunk 2020, you roll 1d10 plus stat, plus skill, plus modifiers, and try to get equal over a target number, which is usually a 15. In Burning Wheel, you have a dice pool of d6s equal to your exponent, and you roll those dice. Any of those that roll equal or over a difficulty number based on your shade for that ability, which will usually be black and thus a 4 or better for a success, you take all those dice that got successes, add them up, and if they equal or match the obstacle, the ob of the roll, then you succeed, and usually that ob will be about a 3. Now, we'll call this the target number method because that's nice and intuitive. Now, the other method is a bit different. You have an inherent base chance of success based on your ability, and then the GM applies bonuses and penalties to modify that chance. So, for instance, in Only War, which is a game that I really need to get around to playing, you have a characteristic or a skill with a percentage rating, and the GM can modify that up and down, usually in increments of 10%, but there can be 5% increments here and there. Now, you roll a d100, and if you roll equal or under that modified rating, then you succeed. The other example would be Alien, which is again a d6 dice pool, but is slightly different than Burning Wheel. You combine a stat plus skill, and then the GM can add or subtract dice based on situational modifiers. Now, if any of those dice come up 6s, then you succeed. Regardless, with these types, there is a base statistical chance of success that is derived directly from your ability, and changing the chance of success comes from changing the value of that ability. And so we'll call this the base chance method. Either way, you always end up with a baseline level of difficulty that the GM uses to modify up and down to indicate how easy or difficult something is, and that is why we're calling it the average difficulty. Now finally we get the average chance. And this is what happens when you combine those two together. When you take a character of average ability and make them roll for a task of average difficulty, then whatever the percentage odds for that are is your average chance. So in Cyberpunk 2020, if you have a stat of 5, skill of 5, difficulty 15, you have a 60% chance of success. If you have, in Burning Wheel, a black shade and an exponent of 4, so that's 4 dice and 4's an up count, then your odds on an obstacle 3 test are 31.25%. In only war, if you have a characteristic of 31% with a skill modifier of 0, which is pretty typical, then you have, a 31% chance of success. And finally, if you are, stat of 3 and skill of 2 in Alien, then you have roughly a 59.81% chance of success. I think one of the most common assumptions about the average chance in an RPG is that it will usually be either 50% or slightly above it. And while that can often be true, as you can see, these things do vary wildly. And so, yeah, that is that is how the three averages shake out. And now that we know what they are, let's put them to use. So, why do people care about averages at all? I don't think it's because people want their characters to be average. First off, if you take a min-maxer who, as the name suggests, make some of their abilities as high as possible while neglecting others they, don't feel they'll need, and so make them as low as possible, that is not what you do when you want to be average at all. In fact, even when you take someone who puts 1 point in every skill to try and be jack of all trades, I don't think it's because they want to be average. I think it's because they don't want to be below average. They want to be able to account for every possibility. And so that is not it. That is a red herring. But I think there are two things that an average does give you. And the first thing would be it gives you a baseline with which to bridge the imaginative gap. It gives you a sense for how good your character is, how difficult the task is, and it gives you much more of a grounding than you might otherwise have. What does a 7 mean? When you think about it, and what that feeds into is it helps you create an expectation. If you are weak in a particular ability, then you can expect to fail with it. If you're presented with a very difficult task, you can also expect that. Having that that predictive sense of what will happen if you attempt an action is something that averages are very useful for. And so yeah, that is what I think we have averages for. And now let's see how that plays out across a variety of scenarios. Okay, so let's see how the use of averages varies from RPG to RPG. There can be a bit of a variation here because some games you are a larger than life hero with a very different average benchmark to a normal person. And in others, you are Joe Normie, but you're up against Cthulhu. And if you try and fight him, you're going to lose. Now, to better elucidate how games like these work, I've got my lovely little genre compass. And no, this is not the political compass rotated 180 degrees so that the authoritarian left is lined up with the grimdark. That'll be petty. And how dare you accuse me of pettiness? But anyway, if we look at the left-right axis, that is how strong the villains are, and the up-down axis is how strong the heroes are. Now, in the top left, we have heroic games. These are strong hero, weak villain, and they're usually either power fantasy or just really bad game balance. And when they shake out, it's usually as not will the hero succeed, but how will the hero succeed? And so yeah, the kind of best examples for this would be D&D 5e with its notoriously easy combat, and Cyberpunk Red with again potentially similarly easy combat. I will talk about that more in my review when that eventually comes out. On the pop culture side, we have Superman, the most overpowered hero of all time, but we also have murder mysteries, which are all about a genius detective finding the mistakes that the culprit made, and proving themselves far smarter than that culprit. Not that the culprits are stupid, but that they aren't as smart as the detective, which leads to their downfall. And so yeah, that is the heroics. Next up in the top right, we have pulpy pulpy stories in games, and these are named after the magazines and comic books of the 20th century that really did exemplify them. These are strong hero, strong villain, and they're about climactic, heroic battles between big damn heroes and big damn villains, and oh my god, and it can go either way, and oh my god, there's so much carnage, and oh my god, and oh my god, and oh my god. Now, there's actually quite a few games in this category. We have RuneQuest, Exalted, Cyberpunk 2020. Yes, 2020 and Red do have very different antagonist power levels, and that really does affect how they both feel. And on the pop culture side, we have the MCU, which I'm not a huge fan of it, but films like Infinity War and Endgame really do they are very down to the wire in some ways. We also have The Witcher. Now, I know what you're thinking. The story is set in grim, gritty medieval Poland, or Poland-esque world. Maybe don't fit in this category, but I would argue that stories about a superhuman mutant fighting superhuman monsters, all to the backdrop of the unstoppable force of fate, kind of fits in the poppy category for me. Now, moving on to the bottom left, we have grounded stories, and these vary from very gritty to very mundane. They're about average people with average problems. And I don't feel that there are a ton of RPGs that fall into this category. Scrolling through my RPG library, all the PDFs I have, the one that stood out to me most as grounded was Green Ronin's Song of Ice and Fire RPG. And that's because while it may seem on the surface to maybe be a game about input and ability, politicking, and maybe you think it should be in the bottom left of Pulpy. The Song of Ice and Fire is all about the mundanity and humanity of the highest levels of society, about their very human struggles and flaws. And so yeah, I do feel it fits there. On the pop culture side, I do feel that I think the most grounded media that I could think of are things like sitcoms, chick flicks, Hallmark movies. A lot of these kind of comfort food media feel the most grounded to me. And finally, we have in the bottom right, we have grimdark. Always getting those confused. Oopsie doopsie. But moving on, this is all about weak hero, strong villain, and so it's all about either overcoming incredible odds or being utterly crushed by them. Games in this category, things like Alien, Only War, early D&D, which had a much more brutal combat and much higher kind of character turnover. And on the media side, we have, I'm going to say The Lord of the Rings is grimdark. And I know what you're thinking, but it really is the story of two hairy-footed midgets called Sam and Frodo on a do-or-die quest to defeat the personification of ultimate evil. A task so daunting that Frodo fails at the final hurdle. And don't let the majesty of Lothlorien fool you, because by the end of the Third Age, it's empty. All the elves leave. And so yeah, it is pretty kind of poignant and grimdark in that sense. If you want a more archetypal grimdark story, then I've been reading a lot of the old dystopian novels lately. Things like 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451, and these are kind of much more archetypal grimdark. So yeah, that is the four genres as I define them. Let's see them in action. Now let's look at how these genres use averages in action. We'll jump right into the heroic games. Now these will go to some efforts to make the PCs feel more powerful than a typical person. There are a couple of ways to do this. Exhibit A is D&D 5e. An average person has a 10 in each of their 6 ability scores, but a level 1 PC will start out with an average of about 13. And bear in mind, they will be up against the toughest of opposition. A single goblin is a hard encounter for a single level 1 PC, and that's despite the goblin's average ability score being 9.67. The fact that the goblin has maybe a 20% chance of killing the PC, or some chance of causing a few hit points of damage is enough to make that considered hard. So yeah, that is how stacked in the PC's favor the encounters can be. But beyond that, we'll look at Savage World. Now in Savage Worlds, PCs are considered wildcards, and NPCs are usually considered extras. Now an extra, to do an action, rolls a die based on their stat or skill, and tries to roll at least a 4. A wildcard still rolls a die based on their stat or skill, but also rolls a d6 and tries to get a 4 on at least 1. Now, a wildcard with a d4 skill and an extra with a d8 skill both have a 62.5% chance of success. And so yeah, both of these methods are used to make the PCs more powerful, to ensure that they consistently win, and that there's no unforeseen swinginess that tries to destroy things and make things go too off the rails. That doesn't really exist in pulpy games. You still have very much above average characters, but you also have very much above average villains, and so it can be much swingier and much deadlier. I think the best example of this is Cyberpunk 2020. because it uses the same character creation rules for both PCs and NPCs. Both of them have all the same stats, skills, access to role abilities, including the very broken solo ability. But they also have access to the same very powerful cyberware that makes them into destructive monster murder machines. And so yeah, Cyberpunk has a very much a reputation, or at least Cyberpunk 2020 has something of a reputation for deadliness, and for the fact that 8 points damage to the head, or 4 points really, since damage to the head is doubled, being an insta kill, and thus being very deadly and character turnovery. But yeah, that is what a poppy game can be like. Now, if we move on to grounded games, that will be tough because I don't have much experience with them, and there don't seem to be a ton out there. Rather than speculating on how they work, I'm going to speculate more on why I think they're so rare. And there's two reasons for this. First off, the mundanity. When you have average heroes and average villains, there's none of that kind of fantastical, larger than lifeiness that gives that really makes the escapism in RPGs possible. Without that, it does get a bit bland. It also gets very swingy. And when you have something like that, when you have an average group of PCs against an average group of NPCs, and potentially a 50-50 outcome to a fight, that can go all over the place. A lot of TPKs and a lot of things like that. But none of the excitement, the adrenaline that you can get from a pulpy game. So yeah, that is why I think that these styles of games are so rare. Now, you might say that, but I think some people say, oh no, this game's gritty, this game is grounded. But I tend to feel that a lot of those games factor into grimdark. Now, speaking of grimdark, there are two ways to do this. Either you have the PCs be way below average, which is kind of rare, but does happen. The Witch is Dead is a one-page RPG about the cute animal familiars of a dead witch avenging themselves upon the witch hunter who killed her. Now, those animals do have magic powers, but they are tiny animals going up against big people with big weapons. And so, yep, if you get into a fight, you can die, as happened to one of the PCs in our one-shot. And so that is not the normal way to do things. The more normal way is kind of more what Alien does. And an Alien, an average character has a 3.5 when an average person has a 3 in each of their stats. But that minor above averageness doesn't really do much against a bloody xenomorph that takes 2 or 3 turns around and rolls between 6 and 10 dice for everything. When I ran through Hope's Last Day, 3 of the 4 PCs were killed in a single fight with a single, one of the weaker xenomorphs, and the 4th didn't last much longer. So yeah, these are generally direct confrontations go badly, and so usually the point is to either avoid them or to bask in an orgy of PC death. That is generally how these work out. And with that, we've been through each of the genres. Okay, so we've seen how different averages affect different RPGs. Now let's see how no average affects an RPG. And my exhibit for this will be Cyberpunk Red. In RPG discourse, we sometimes talk about simulationism, the idea that an RPG should be realistic and that its mechanics should replicate reality and any and all intricacies therein. Cyberpunk Red flatly rejects this, and I would call it just pretty much anti-simulationist in the way that it works. Rather than being a circle of diminishing damage, a grenade template is a 10 by 10 meter square where everyone takes the same amount of force. The cover physics are notoriously cartoonish. Oh, and there's no average for either stats or skills. Now, you may be wondering, surely in the book it says something about, what stats are, what their range is, what the average is. And you're right, there is a section on stats and what their range is. The book says that it's from 1 to 8, although in my experience it's more like 2 to 8, but whatever. Now, as for what it says about averages and quality, it says, well, a 5 is better than a 4, and a 4 is worse than a 6. That is not an average. There is no average in any explanation in the book regarding stats. Now, you could say, oh, well, I mean, it's probably a 5 because, Cyberpunk 2020 had 5 as its average. To which I say 1. Cyberpunk 2020 had 5 or 6 as the average. And 2, 2020 went up to 10 with its stats, while Red caps them at 8. Okay, you say, well, Fusion, from the same publisher, with very kind of similarish mechanics, had the average at 4 and also had the stats capped at 8. But it also had skills capped at 8 and red caps them at 10. So it is not using the kind of dice maths of fusion. In fact, there are a few other differences. Things like fusion had meet or beat for target numbers, while red is beat only. So there are a few differences there. And so you can go and look and say, okay, well, a complete package PC gets 62 points divided among 10 stats. Note, PCs have 10 stats, NPCs only have 9, because NPCs don't have the luck metacurrency stat thing. But for PCs with their 10 stats and their 62 points, they get an average of 6.2. And you can say, okay, so we've got that for PCs. Let's look at NPCs and maybe try and figure it out from that. Okay, let's do that. In the back of the core book, we have 10 NPC stat blocks divided into 4 categories in a kind of enemy strength, challenge rating kind of deal. Now, there are some other stat blocks that are in some of the free DLCs. We won't look at them because they are specifically meant to have a different power level to the ones in the book, so that would just muddy the waters. Now, the lowest level of baddie in Cyberpunk is a mook, and they recommend you put 1 mook per PC in a fight. And total up all the stats for mooks, and you find an average of 3.72, which is 40% lower than the average PC. Which, pretty stark difference. You'd say, okay, maybe, round it up to 4, maybe 4 is. Okay, let's look deeper. Let's look deeper. Okay, and you say, next step up is Lieutenant. And they say one of these per 2 PCs. And you look at those stat blocks and you see that the average is 5.07, which is 19% lower than a PC and 36% higher than a mook. You can then also look at the highest level ones, which are the mini bosses and the 1 boss stat block, and those have an average of 5.67 and 6.11 respectively. And so 4 or 5 seems about right, but it's never really called out. And you can even ask the designers, and many people have, both in the Artel Saurian Games Discord, and it's asking them in Q&As. And I've never really seen them give a straight answer. And the truth is, I think the reason is there is not meant to be a human average. The values of stats, as you can see from the wildly varying NPC strengths, are meant to serve the mechanics, to serve the game, and to serve the balance. This is a very, like I said, an anti-simulationist game. It is not meant to have an average. But there is another level to this. And so, stick around for a second. There's more. You see, with skills, there is almost a facsimile of averages. Skills as above are rated from 0 to 10, and when combined with the stats for making rolls to form the skill base, they go from 1 to 18. Well, I mean from 0 to 32, but we'll leave that to one side. Now, the book actually gives us guidelines on roughly how good you are at bases 10, 14, and 18. And I know what you're thinking. Finally, we have a sense of where the average is. We'll see. And I think a good thing to look at here would be persuasion. Now, at base 10 persuasion, you win most debates, and whatever that is. But you also are able to convince your mainline that blonde she caught you with was your sister. Now, just a side note, depending where your mainline caught you, that might not make things better. Anyway, at base 14, you're a smooth talker with a good shot at city politics, and at base 18, you are so charming that you can convince almost anyone of almost anything. And okay, which of those is average? Well, none of them. Winning most debates is kind of, most people don't win most debates, and that applies both in the sense of the kind of university debate club style debate, and also in the arguing with your mate over whether pineapple belongs on pizza type of debate, which, I mean, obviously it does, but let's face it, not all of you will agree with me. And so yeah, even then, I wouldn't say this is an average, good, great distinction that you might see in some other places. It's more of a good, better, best distinction. A base 10 from winning most debates is already kind of above average. And so you can say, okay, well, where is the average for skills then? and you can say, looking at the bases, well, an 8 is enough to have a 50% chance at a DV13 roll. And so you can say, okay, maybe 8 is the average. And in truth, we don't have any real guidance on what your skill level is like below a 10. It could be that, a 7, an 8, a 9 is average. It could be that it's dog poo. The rules just don't say. Now, in my review of Cyberpunk Red, I will actually defend this system for unrelated reasons that I'm not going into here. But I do feel that it doesn't really give a lot of the guidance that's needed. And that can be said, for a lot of things in Cyberpunk. But I think as I kind of conclude this case study, I do need to make an important point. Cyberpunk Red does have an issue with lacking averages and with lacking tangibility. It does have an issue with the imaginative gap. It's still a very rules-light game. It's still easy enough to learn, and it's still incredibly fun. I've GM'd almost 20 sessions of it, and I've played in a whole hell of a lot more than that. You can learn this. You can figure it out. It will take some rationalization, some suspension of disbelief, some fiddling around, maybe a house rule or two. You can do this. And so I think what this does prove is that while averages are important, they aren't essential. They write a guideline, but they certainly aren't the be-all and the end-all. And with that, I think it's time to start wrapping things up. And now let's tie this video up in a lovely little bow. Averages then are a means to an end more so than an end in themselves. They help give a baseline for how powerful your character is, what they can do, and how easy or difficult things are. But they're not necessarily what you would want your character to be or to feel like. That's kind of why grounded games are less common, shall we say. Now, beyond that, they do also serve as a very good tool for dealing with the imaginative gap, for helping to contextualize things and make it easier to kind of join in that shared delusion that we all have at the table. But the most important thing that they really do, in my opinion, is helping to kind of set the tone of a game. Where you set the average really does affect how a game feels, how escapist, how dramatic, how dangerous. All comes down, maybe not all, but a lot of it does come down to where that average baseline is. And you know what? Even if you don't have averages, or even just have a very wishy-washy average, I will admit that does make things harder. But it doesn't make things impossible. That kind of anti-simulationist way of doing things is surmountable. And I think the ultimate conclusion of this video is there's no one way, there's no average way to play an RPG. And so figure out what you like, what helps you have the most fun, and play the way that you want to play. And here we come to the end of this video. Thank you all very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, then please give me a like, a share, and a subscribe. If you have any feedback, criticisms, disagreements, suggestions, then please leave a nice, respectful comment in the section down below. The next video on this channel will be a very short comedy skit thing that I've made randomly, which should be coming out on the 1st of April. It's already recorded, but I might make some tweaks to it between now and then. After that will be another RPG philosophy video towards the end of April. There is, as I've mentioned now a few times, a Cyberpunk Red review coming. I have almost an hour and a half of audio recorded for that, but I also have another 3.5 to 6.5 hours to go. So that will be very chunky, and so it will take a while. I expect that to be coming out the second half of this year. Now, until then, this is why I'll be keeping up with these shorter videos. And that is all for now. I wish you all a great day. And until next we meet, farewell.